Hello everyone, welcome. Here we are, the second Wednesday of the month. I don't even know what day it is. December 9, I guess. Welcome to our online Carb Smart class. My name is Melissa. I'm HealthWare's registered dietitian and personal trainer. Welcome if you're watching the live version of this class or if you're watching the recorded version later on. I'm so glad you're here. Ooh, itchy nose. All right, so today our topic is dairy. Are we ready? Yes, this is not something we've talked about yet specifically, so I'm a little bit excited about this topic. I'm not sure why. Let's get going. If you have any questions or feedback, comments during this class or after this class, please let me know. You can type those in the comment section, the little chat box. I'm happy to answer any questions that I can during or after the class. So let's do it. Dairy foods like milk, yogurt, and cheese are typically recognized for being sources of protein and calcium. But did you know that they're actually a source of carbohydrates as well? Some people are surprised to learn that. I'm actually surprised when I see patients and I find out that they don't know that dairy is a carbohydrate. Something that you should know. Let's talk first now about the nutrition composition of dairy foods. Dairy foods contain a combination of the three macronutrients: fat, protein, and carbohydrates. The amount of fat and protein in dairy can vary quite a bit between different items. For example, the fat content is very different between skim or non-fat milk and whole milk. The carbohydrate amount in dairy can vary as well, of course, as we'll see a little bit later as we go through some examples. The carbs come from a naturally occurring sugar that is unique to milk. You've likely heard of it. It is lactose. There is some amount of lactose in most dairy foods, except for those that exclusively isolate the fat, like butter, or the protein, like a whey protein powder. Let's talk more about the lactose. So lactose is a type of sugar, and it's quickly broken down by the body's digestive system. That's what happens with sugars. Since lactose is a type of sugar, it does give a sweet flavor, a mild sweet flavor, to plain milk and plain yogurt. As I mentioned, it is a naturally occurring sugar. So it's not part of that bad added sugar category that we've talked about in past classes. So when you hear added sugar, not lactose, okay? However, it's still a type of sugar which can digest and absorb very quickly in the body, as I said. So it's important to be mindful of how much dairy you consume, especially if you're diabetic or you're trying to manage your blood sugar levels. When discussing lactose, another important factor to consider is lactose intolerance. People with lactose intolerance are unable to fully digest lactose, that naturally occurring sugar in dairy. As a result, they can get uncomfortable GI symptoms like diarrhea, gas, bloating, other things, after consuming dairy products. I would be willing to bet that at least one person listening is lactose intolerant. I am, as are my sister and my dad. So it's a much more common condition than you may think. If you're lactose intolerant, there are a couple options. You can try over-the-counter lactose enzyme medications. Lactaid is a very common one. You can also just avoid dairy completely, and that's what I tend to do. Or because the carbohydrate and lactose content varies between different dairy products, you can experiment to see which of those lower lactose foods may work for you. Because the carbohydrate amount does vary between different types of dairy foods, let's compare some of them. We'll talk through the different categories. So first, we have carbohydrates in milk. Milk, it has a pretty consistent amount of lactose in it, so the carbohydrate content is very similar for all the different types of milk, like skim, 1%, 2%, and whole milk. depending on the brand, there is some variation. 1 cup of milk, regardless of the fat content, typically contains between 12 and 16 grams of carbohydrates. So if you're diabetic or count carbohydrates, 1 cup of milk would count as 1 serving or 1 exchange, if you do the exchange system, of carbohydrates. For reference, a standard piece of bread, 1 piece of bread, is about 15 grams of carbohydrates. So 1 cup of milk is basically the equivalent of that. Be careful with those flavored milks though, like chocolate or strawberry. They usually do contain added sugars, not just that lactose sugar. Now we're gonna move on to carbohydrates in cheese, a very popular food that I hear from patients and friends, very popular food in America in general. So, in general, cheese has higher proportions of fat and protein, so the amount of carbohydrate and lactose is lower than the amount in milk. I want to just say I didn't quite explain it. So carbohydrates and lactose are very directly related. So a food that is high in carbohydrates, that's a dairy food, would generally be high in lactose, and a food that's low in carbohydrates would be low in lactose within the dairy realm in general. Okay, so back to cheese. There's approximately 1 gram or less of carbohydrate in 1 ounce of cheese, and I have a list. So 1 ounce of carbohydrate or less, which is a very, very small amount. So in all of these cheeses that I'm gonna list, mozzarella, feta, provolone, cheddar, Swiss, camembert, Gruyere, brie, cotija, and goat cheese. All of those. And that's not the only cheeses. It's a very extensive list, actually, of the low carbohydrate or low lactose types of cheeses. 1 tablespoon of regular cream cheese also falls into that same category of being lower than 1 gram of carbohydrate. Because the carbohydrate content is low in these cheeses, that does mean that the lactose content is relatively low as well. If you are lactose intolerant, you may actually be able to eat some of those low carb cheeses without any digestive issues. Flipping over my notes. There are a few types of cheeses though that do contain notable amounts of carbohydrates. If you're trying to manage your carb intake or you're lactose intolerant, it's important to learn which types of cheese are high in carbs and lactose. The higher carb cheeses that we typically encounter in the US are cottage cheese and ricotta. And the carbohydrate content does vary slightly between the skim or part skim or non-fat versions and the whole milk versions a little bit. But in general, both of those are in the not high carb, but they contain more than 1 gram of carbohydrate. In general, those 2 types of cheeses, the different varieties, contain between 5 and 9 grams of carbohydrate in a half cup serving. Okay, those aren't huge numbers in terms of carbohydrates, 5 to 9 grams, but it can be a lot in terms of lactose for those who are intolerant. I know me for one, I cannot eat cottage cheese. Cheese can easily be part of one's diet for those that have diabetes or are trying to manage their carbohydrate intake. As you can see that we talked about, cheese doesn't have a ton of carbohydrates in it. However, just because the majority of cheeses are low in carbohydrates, that doesn't mean it's a free pass to eat as much as you want. Most cheeses do contain cholesterol and or saturated fat, neither of which is good for our heart health or our overall health. The next topic we're going to cover within the dairy spectrum is carbohydrates in yogurt. Yogurt tends to have a wider range of carbohydrates than cheese or milk because of how many different types there are. Yogurt can be made from whole milk, low-fat milk, or non-fat milk. or goat milk and can come in Greek style or in regular varieties. Yogurt can also be sweetened with an assortment of sugars, syrups, or the sugar-free artificial sweeteners. Because of the vast options, it's important to read the nutrition label on each yogurt to determine the carbohydrate and sugar content. The sugar content is very important to look at on yogurt. We'll get there in a minute. So, in general, non-fat, plain Greek yogurt has the lowest amount of carbohydrates, often 10 grams or less per cup, which is a decent amount of yogurt. Non-fat, plain, regular yogurt, so not Greek style, just the regular type of plain yogurt, typically has slightly more carbohydrates because it's not that Greek style, but nowhere near the amount that the low-fat, fruit-flavored yogurts contain. So low-fat, fruit-flavored yogurts, like those red-labeled Yoplait, the Yoplait original yogurts is what they're called, those are usually sweetened with both fruit and added sugars, and one cup contains anywhere between 30 and 50 grams of carbohydrates. It's a lot of carbohydrates in some of those yogurts. Non-fat or those light yogurts, so that would be the blue label for a Yoplait brand. Those sweetened yogurts do contain fewer carbohydrates, but they typically also contain artificial sweeteners. That's how they get them to be lower carbohydrate. And those artificial sweeteners aren't necessarily something I recommend eating a lot of. Some people with lactose intolerance are able to eat yogurt without GI distress, while others cannot. Unfortunately, I am in that category of I can't eat yogurt. There are many options though for lactose-free yogurts these days for those who want to eat yogurt but don't tolerate the typical lactose content. I also wanted to mention about milk. There is lactose-free versions of milk as well. There's one or two brands that I've seen that contain pretty low carbohydrates, about 6 grams of carbohydrates in a cup for milk. But in general, some brands have pretty much the same carbohydrate content in that lactose-free version. Now we're moving on to everyone's favorite food, ice cream. Carbohydrates in ice cream. Like yogurt, the carbohydrate amount in ice cream can vary hugely between the different types. Ice cream usually contains a significant amount of added sugar, in addition to the naturally occurring lactose sugar, so it's something that really should be eaten in moderation or for special occasions. It's not something that we should be eating every day in large quantities. So for perspective, a 2/3 cup serving, so smaller than my fist, a 2/3 cup serving of Ben & Jerry's chocolate chip cookie dough ice cream contains 42 grams of carbohydrates, and 28 grams of that is from added sugars. White sugar, brown sugar, and molasses is what they list on their package. So ice cream, yes, is something that really should be eaten in moderation if we're talking about just health in general, but also carbohydrate management. Claudia said, wow, Greek yogurt. She said, yeah, Greek yogurt, switching to Greek yogurt. Greek yogurt does tend to be a little more on the sour side. If the plain Greek yogurt, like plain, no flavor, that one does tend to be pretty tart, but it is the lowest in sugar, the lowest in carbohydrates in general. If we're not going into the artificial sweetener realm. So just straight plain Greek yogurt is probably the best choice, carbohydrate and sugar wise, but you can add your own flavorings to it. So you could even add like a tiny bit of vanilla extract or cinnamon. You could add your own fresh fruit to it, like berries, or I've added like a tiny spoon of jam, like a reduced sugar jam to it. So you can do a lot with the plain Greek yogurt. You have a lot more control over how much sugar is going into it to flavor it when you're doing it yourself. Okay, get off my little soapbox. Next, we're gonna talk about carbohydrates in butter. I'm gonna take a quick sip of water though. Okay, carbohydrates in butter. So butter is primarily made with milk fat and a very small amount of the milk protein and essentially 0 carbohydrates, okay? Again, it doesn't give you a free pass to eat as much butter as you like because it does contain high amounts of fat, primarily in the form of saturated fat, which is not ideal for our heart health or our overall health. 1 tablespoon of butter, just regular butter, contains approximately 100 calories, 12 grams of fat, and I want to say 7 of that might be saturated fat, and 0 carbohydrates. So butter is a no carbohydrate food, but a very high fat food and not the kind of healthy fat for us. Now, I've talked all about dairy, but let's talk about the carbohydrates in the plant-based, non-dairy dairy. So as you may know, so I don't eat dairy, partly because I'm lactose intolerant, partly because I'm vegan. And there are many options of plant-based or non-dairy dairy foods these days, tons of options. And typically in every type of grocery store, you'll find options for non-dairy dairy foods. So those foods, these plant-based dairy foods, don't contain lactose, that naturally occurring sugar in milk. They don't contain that at all. However, many of them do contain added sugar. So, flip my notes again. So for non-dairy milk, we're going to talk through the different categories of these really quickly. For non-dairy milk, pretty popular these days. Whatever variety you prefer, whether it's soy, almond, cashew, oat, rice, macadamia, you name it, it's best to choose the unsweetened version to avoid any added sugars. Unsweetened versions of those plant-based milks should not have any sugar added into them. They may have a tiny bit of sugar from the actual food it's made from. So for example, oat or rice might have a little bit of sugar in it just naturally. And that's again not the same thing as added sugar if it was a sweetened version of the milk. So make sure you check your almond milk or soy milk packages at home if you have that type of milk to make sure that it does say unsweetened on it. The same goes for the non-dairy yogurts. Although unsweetened non-dairy yogurt can be a little more difficult to find, it's not very typical to find unsweetened non-dairy yogurts in stores. There is a brand that I do like. It's by So Delicious, I'm pretty sure. It's by So Delicious. It is actually the coconut milk yogurt, and they do have an unsweetened version. They have unsweetened plain and unsweetened vanilla, and they carry it in large containers or in just the single serving containers. That is typically my choice if I'm going to get a non-dairy yogurt. I get the unsweetened version of that coconut yogurt. Do keep in mind that because it is coconut based, it has a little bit of saturated fat in it, which is not necessarily something we want to eat a lot of, but in the yogurt world, you're probably not going to get tons of saturated fat by choosing that particular yogurt. Okay, there are really high fat versions of coconut yogurt though, so be cautious with those because those will have a lot more saturated fat in them. All right, non-dairy cheese. Those are made from a variety of plant-based sources, and therefore they can vary significantly with carbohydrate content. So it's important to read the nutrition label to find that carbohydrate content and the sugar content. Some of my favorite brands are nut-based, and they contain 0, I think one of them is 0 or very, very few grams of carbohydrates because they're primarily nut-based or coconut-based. Some brands might be made with other types of plant sources, so they could contain more carbohydrates. And do make sure to read the ingredients to see if there's any added sugars. Non-dairy butter is usually pretty similar to regular butter in that it's mostly made of fat. Be sure to read the nutrition label though, again, of any non-dairy butter to confirm that it's low in carbohydrates. The one that I typically use that I'm thinking of doesn't have any carbohydrates in it, which is pretty standard. Usually the non-dairy butters are made with some mix of oils and sometimes nuts, which are quite low in carbohydrates. And then non-dairy ice cream, we must touch on this. I love non-dairy ice cream, one of my favorite foods. And it's basically the same story as regular ice cream though, when it comes to the sugar and the carbohydrate content. High in carbohydrates and high in sugar, just like regular ice cream is. There are, I didn't say this, but there are some low or no sugar added ice creams out there in the regular and I think in the non-dairy world, but those will have those artificial sweeteners added, which again, not something that I choose to eat and that I recommend eating a lot of. So back to the ice cream though. For example, within this non-dairy ice cream realm, a 2/3 cup serving, so that's the same serving size as the other ice cream we talked about, a 2/3 cup serving of Ben & Jerry's chocolate chip cookie dough non-dairy frozen dessert contains 49 grams of carbohydrates, 33 of which come from added sugars. And actually, the carbs and sugar are higher in the non-dairy version than the regular version. They're both high, but the non-dairy version is a little bit higher even. So ice cream really is something that you need to be careful about if you have diabetes or if you're trying to manage your blood sugar or in general. So in summary, dairy foods can easily be included in your diet, whether you have diabetes or you're trying to manage your carbohydrate intake. But some types of dairy food do contain significantly more carbohydrates and sugar than others, whether it's the lactose sugar or added sugars. So it's important to learn which are the best options for you. I also want to mention that dairy does not have to be part of your diet. That's why I wanted to include the plant-based side of things. Dairy is a source of calcium and protein, but there are so many plant-based sources that are also rich in calcium and protein. So don't feel that you must eat dairy foods, especially if you're lactose intolerant. If you're lactose intolerant, I tried using the lactate pills and that's not something that I liked living on and they didn't work very well for me anyway. So if you're lactose intolerant, I really do recommend maybe not doing too many dairy products. Let me know if you have any questions about anything I've talked about. I know dairy is an interesting topic for a lot of people, a lot of questions sometimes. Let me know in the little chat section, whether you're watching live right now or the recorded version later on. I can always see those and answer any comments or questions that you have. Thank you so much for watching class today. I'm so glad that you're here. I hope you learned a little bit of something. This class will be again in January. I won't see you for Carb Smart again until the new year. Let me know if you have any topics you'd like me to cover or anything you want included in next class. I would love to hear your feedback. That is all for today. Have a wonderful Wednesday. I will be back tomorrow, 9 a.m. for our online strength training class. Bye.